I wasn't supposed to feel anything anymore. Not after losing David. Not after growing invisible in my own life. But the way Mark looked at me that morning, half asleep, hair tousled, eyes still soft from dreams, something in me stirred. It wasn't lust. It was the aching reminder that I still existed, that maybe, just maybe, I could still be wanted. The eggs sizzled in the pan, but my thoughts drowned them out. Julia had already rushed out for court, briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other. Mark came in minutes later, tie loose, barefoot on the cool tiles. He smiled, just a polite gesture, and reached for the kettle. "You're up early," he said. I nodded, watching his fingers wrap around the mug. Old habits. He didn't know what it cost to say that I used to wake up before sunrise because David's chemo made him sickest at dawn. Mark sat down, scrolling through his phone. I placed a plate in front of him. He looked up, surprised. "You didn't have to." I smiled, gentle. "I wanted to." He hesitated just for a moment, then said thank you low, almost embarrassed, and picked up his fork. I sat across from him, watching the steam curl up between us. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full, heavy. His knuckles brushed the table's edge. Mine did the same. He glanced up once, just once. But it stayed with me the whole day later. I folded laundry in the guest room. A pair of his socks ended up in my hands. I held them longer than I should have. It was pathetic. I knew that. But something about the way they were still warm from the dryer. It felt like proximity, like permission. The sun slanted through the window. Afternoon light, thick and golden. I heard the front door open, his footsteps, then the fridge door, then nothing, just the air, humming with things unsaid. I stayed still, breath held, and in that moment, I wasn't Julia's mother. I wasn't the widow. I wasn't 60. I was just a woman who remembered what it felt like to be wanted, and feared how far she'd go to feel that way again. I wasn't supposed to feel anything anymore. Not after losing David. Not after all those birthdays spent alone. Not after becoming the kind of woman people pass by without remembering. But the way Mark looked at me that morning, barefoot, half awake, rubbing his temple, as if sleep still clung to his thoughts. Something shifted, something warm, something dangerous. The morning light slanted through the kitchen blinds, soft and golden, dust hanging in the air like secrets. I stood over the stove, stirring scrambled eggs I didn't need, listening to the clock tick louder than necessary. The door creaked. His steps were familiar now, heavy, but careful. He never slammed anything, not even when he was clearly tired or upset. "You're up early," he said, his voice gravelly. I didn't turn around. Habit. He poured coffee, leaned against the counter. I could hear the way he exhaled, like he was letting go of more than sleep, maybe stress from work, maybe something else. I didn't ask. "I made some breakfast," I said. "Thought you might want a break from toast and peanut butter." There was a pause. I could feel it land in the space between us. "You didn't have to," he said finally. I turned then, placed the plate in front of him. I know. He looked at the food, then up at me, his eyes softening. Thank you. That simple sentence, just that. It wasn't romantic, not in words, but it lingered. It held warmth like a hand held too long. I sat across from him, watching the way he buttered his toast. Left-handed, he used the dull side of the knife. I'd never noticed that before. The details came easier now. I was paying attention to the wrong things. He asked how I slept. I said fine. I asked about work. He said nothing new. And that was that, ordinary words. But something pulsed underneath them after he left. The house folded back into its quiet self. I carried the plates to the sink, washed them slowly. I ran my thumb along the edge of his coffee mug, felt the heat that hadn't yet faded. That small, lingering warmth. It stayed with me later that day. Julia called from work. Her voice was clipped, distracted. She was always multitasking now. Something about a court filing. A judge who didn't grant a motion. I told her not to worry, that I'd make dinner. Stress, I said. Mark and I will be fine. She thanked me, distracted, and hung up before I could say more. Around 5, I peeled carrots at the kitchen island. Mark walked in, loosened his tie, placed his briefcase down with a sigh. He looked exhausted. Long day? I asked, not looking up. Yeah, he said. Too many meetings. I made chicken pot pie. He paused. That's Julia's favorite. I smiled faintly. Yours too, isn't it? There was a moment, a flicker of something in his eyes. He looked away, took off his watch, rubbed the back of his neck. You don't have to do this, he said, voice low. I turned back to the cutting board. Do what? He didn't answer, just walked past me, toward the stairs. The air felt heavier after he left, as if he'd taken something with him. That night, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine. The crickets sang in the distance. The sky was painted in indigo and gold, and everything felt too still, too fragile. I thought about the way he said thank you, the way he hesitated before walking away. And I knew I was no longer just a guest in this house. I was part of something unspoken, something waiting to unravel. I shouldn't have stayed this long, but I couldn't bring myself to leave, not yet. Not while the quiet between us still felt like a beginning. The mornings settled into a kind of rhythm. Julia was always out early, laptop bag slung over one shoulder, heels echoing down the front steps. She rarely looked back. Mark followed minutes later, slower, more present somehow. He'd nod good morning, smile briefly, and leave the smell of his cologne lingering behind like a fingerprint. I didn't plan to stay this long. 2 weeks, maybe 3. But the quiet suited me. The house breathed differently than mine. There was life here, motion. The way the light moved across the wooden floors, the low hum of the coffee machine, even the messes, mail scattered on the counter, shoes by the door, felt like signs of something alive. Mark started coming home later, not suspiciously late, just enough to notice. He looked tired, edges soft. He loosened his tie as soon as he stepped inside, rubbed his temples. Sometimes I'd already have dinner halfway ready. Julia always texted that she was held up at work. I started expecting it. "You're making that roast again?" Mark asked one evening, stepping into the kitchen. "I thought you liked it," I replied without turning around. He leaned on the counter. "I do. Julia says you made it 3 times this week." I laughed softly. Maybe I'm running out of recipes. He didn't say anything else, just watched me, eyes resting on my hands as I chopped garlic. His gaze lingered longer than it should have. Or maybe I lingered in it that night. We ate without Julia. She called around 7, apologizing with half her attention. Mark muted the TV after dinner. I brought him a glass of red wine, and for a second, his fingers brushed mine. Not accident, not quite intentional, just held a beat too long. We sat in the living room, the air thick with unsaid things. I asked about his day. He talked about a client who kept changing deadlines. I laughed at his frustration. Too warmly, too easily. His eyes flicked toward me, surprised by the softness of my voice. "You don't talk much about yourself," he said. "There's not much to tell," I replied. He tilted his head. "I don't believe that." I paused, looked at him, really looked. "I used to dance," I said, surprising even myself. He smiled. "Ballet?" "No," I laughed. "Swing, I liked the spins." He chuckled. "I can't picture that." "Of course you can't. I haven't done it in decades." He sipped his wine. "I think you could still do it." There it was again. That warmth, that awareness. A quiet current pulling us closer. Even as we sat apart later, I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing our glasses. He brought his over, paused beside me. "Thanks for dinner," he said. I turned to face him. "Anytime." He looked like he wanted to say more. Instead, he nodded, turned, and disappeared up the stairs. I stayed there, fingers wet and pruned, heart too loud in my chest. That night, I dreamed I was dancing, spinning, light on my feet, laughter in my mouth. But when I reached out for my partner's hand, it was Mark's. And I didn't let go. It started with little things. A fresh shirt pressed just right. A tray of brownies cooled on the counter, still warm when he walked in. A passing compliment that landed softer than expected. "That color suits you," I said one morning. He looked up from his coffee, surprised. The shirt was navy, simple, but it brought out the depth in his eyes. "Thanks," he replied, a little awkward. "Julia picked it." "Of course she did," I smiled. "She has good taste." He nodded, but there was a pause, the kind that catches on something unsaid. In the afternoons, I found myself in the same room more often, folding laundry in the living room while he worked at the kitchen table, watering plants near the window while he made phone calls. Always nearby, but never too close, always casual, always rehearsed. But I watched him, the way he rubbed his temples when he was stuck, the way he exhaled when reading something difficult, how he chewed the inside of his cheek when concentrating. It felt like learning a language only I spoke. He noticed me too. I saw it in the small delays, the way he'd glance up when I walked by, the pause before he answered when I called his name, the way way he smiled at my jokes, even when they weren't funny. One evening, Julia stayed late again. I told Mark I'd cook something simple. "It's just chili," I said. "Hope you're not tired of it." He smiled. "Never am." We ate on the patio. The night was warm, air thick with the scent of cut grass and blooming lavender. Crickets filled the silence. I poured him another glass of wine. He reached for it, and our fingers met again, not by mistake. This time, neither of us moved. His eyes met mine. "Elizabeth," he began. "Yes." He stopped, shook his head. "Nothing." I leaned back. "You sure?" He looked away, then back. I don't want to make things complicated." I tilted my head. "You haven't." He looked down at his hands. "It already feels like it is." We sat in silence. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against my arms, raising goosebumps. "I didn't plan this," I said softly. "I know, but you feel it too, don't you?" His silence was answer enough. Later that night, I found him in the living room, book in hand, but unread. I sat on the far end of the couch, close enough to feel the heat between us. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He didn't look up. "Sure." "Do you ever think about another life?" He looked at me then fully, the book forgotten. "Sometimes," he said. "What would it look like?" He hesitated then. "Quieter, less performing." We were both quiet again. "I think about it too," I whispered. His hand rested on the couch cushion, just inches from mine. We didn't touch, but we didn't need to. The ache was loud enough. The heat settled in that week, the kind of thick, unmoving warmth that wrapped around your skin and refused to let go. Even the walls seemed to sweat. Julia had left early for a client meeting in New York, wouldn't be back until late. Mark worked from home. Papers spread across the kitchen table, his laptop humming quietly beside him. I stayed, mostly outside by the pool. The water shimmered, untouched. I wore a light robe, the kind meant to breathe in the sun, not cover. I moved slowly, deliberately, watering the potted plants, pretending not to look through the glass at him. But I did often. He didn't notice at first. Or maybe he pretended not to around noon. I waved to him. He looked up, hesitated, then stood and slid the glass door open. "You look warm," I said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Feels like the air's not moving. Come sit. You need a break." He joined me on the lounge chair beside mine. The silence between us was soft, familiar. I reached out, let my fingers rest lightly on his arm. "You seem tense," I said. He didn't respond. "Let me help," I whispered, shifting behind him. My hands moved to his shoulders, gentle at first. I could feel it, the weight he carried there, the quiet storm he never let loose. I pressed slowly, tracing the lines of tension with my thumbs. He didn't pull away. Instead, his head dropped slightly forward, a long breath escaping him. "It's okay," I said. "Just breathe." The rhythm between us changed, not in words, in energy. A current passed beneath my hands, from his skin into mine. A quiet hum that made the air feel heavier. His muscles softened. I closed my eyes. I wasn't thinking. Not really. I was remembering, how it felt to be close to someone, to be needed without having to speak. The kind of closeness that used to be second nature, that had disappeared with time and grief and silence. Then he spoke, barely a whisper. "Elizabeth," I paused, waiting. "We can't," he said, his voice tight. I opened my eyes, his body was still, but there was a tremble in it. "Not here," he added. I pulled my hands away slowly. "Then where, Mark?" He stood up, his eyes wouldn't meet mine. "I don't know. I need to think." He left me there, alone on the lounger, the sun high, unflinching, the water still untouched. I lay back, eyes closed, my chest rising with slow, deliberate breath. I knew I'd gone too far, but I also knew it wasn't just me anymore. He felt it, even if he was too afraid to admit it. The sky turned violet that evening, one of those slow, melting dusks that felt like the world was trying to forget itself. Julia had flown out that morning for a weekend conference, 3 days, just Mark and me in the house. I made dinner without asking what he wanted. Roast chicken, lemon thyme, roasted potatoes, the kind he always reached for first. I lit candles, not too many, just enough for the table to glow. He came home later than usual, his steps heavier. His tie was gone, sleeves rolled up. He paused when he saw the table. "You didn't have to. I wanted to," I said. He nodded, set his keys down slowly. I poured him a glass of wine. We ate mostly in silence, the kind that felt like holding breath. His fork scraped the plate softly. My hands stayed still on the napkin in my lap. "This is really good," he said. "Thank you." His eyes met mine, held for a second too long. Then he looked down. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The record player hummed something soft. Jazz, old and warm. I sat on the couch. He hesitated, then joined me. We sat with our glasses. I watched his thumb circle the rim of his. "I don't know what we're doing," he said quietly. "I do." He turned his head, his expression unreadable. "We're standing in the middle of a line," I whispered, "and pretending we haven't already crossed it." He swallowed hard, said nothing. I leaned in just enough for him to feel it. The wine sat warm in my chest. But it wasn't the wine that made me bold. It was the ache, the knowing. "You feel it, Mark," I said. "Stop trying to erase it." He looked at me then, really looked, a kind of quiet surrender in his face. His hand brushed against mine. It didn't feel accidental. I reached for it, held it. "Tell me to stop," I said. He didn't. The world didn't move for a long time later. We stood in the hallway. The light from the kitchen spilled across the floor. His chest rose and fell too fast. Mine, the same. "This isn't right," he said. "I know." He didn't move. "Then why does it feel like the only thing that is?" I asked. He closed his eyes. When they opened, they didn't look away from mine. I held out my hand. He stared at it. Then he took it, quietly, without a word. And I led him up the stairs. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds its breath. A single lamp cast amber light against the wall, soft and flickering. The door clicked shut behind us, but it sounded far away. Everything did. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Mark stood near the window, his back to me, shoulders stiff beneath his shirt. I stood still by the bed, the weight of the moment pressing into my ribs. The air between us pulsed with all the things we'd almost said. When he turned, his eyes weren't asking for permission. They were pleading for understanding. I stepped closer slowly, not out of seduction, but surrender. And then something shifted, not the furniture, not the light, something quieter. It was the feeling of time curling in on itself, the years of loneliness cracking open, spilling into the room like heat rising off pavement. I could feel the echo of every night I had spent wondering if anyone would ever look at me like that again. He reached for me, not my body, my name, my grief, my need to be seen, the part of me that had been waiting, not for a man, but for meaning. When his hands met mine, it wasn't about possession. It was emerging, a trembling energy that rose from our skin and moved inward, as if our bones had remembered something our minds were still too afraid to name. No words, only breath, uneven, unsteady, the kind of breath that says, "I can't take this anymore." There was no urgency, just gravity. I closed my eyes, and the world around us folded in that silence. We were Elizabeth and Mark. We weren't mother-in-law or husband. We were two people standing at the edge of something irreversible and stepping forward together after. We didn't speak right away. He lay beside me, facing the ceiling, his breathing slowed, mine followed. I stared at the soft glow on the wall, the outlines of the lamp's shade, the shadow of our shapes. Barely touching, I reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. "Do you regret it?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time then. "I don't know." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, because I knew some truths are too heavy for daylight, too honest for words. But still, we stayed there side by side, suspended in something neither of us could name, but both of us had called for in silence. The morning after was all sharp edges and hushed noise. Mark had left the room before sunrise. I heard the soft click of the door, the creak in the floorboards, the way the silence returned like a punishment. I stayed in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as the pale blue light seeped through the curtains. Downstairs, I moved through the kitchen like a ghost. Coffee, toast, dishes, all mechanical. The clink of a spoon felt too loud. I touched the counter where he'd leaned the night before. It was cold. He avoided me for most of the day, worked in the study with the door half closed, his phone pressed to his ear, even when it wasn't ringing. I passed by once. He didn't look up. I could feel the weight of it between us, what we'd done, what it meant, what it didn't. In the late afternoon, I took the laundry upstairs, folded his t-shirts with steady hands. When I picked up the gray one he always wore on weekends, something in me cracked. I pressed it to my chest for a moment, just long enough to remember warmth. Julia called around 5. I answered with a practiced smile in my voice. "How's everything?" she asked. "Fine," I said, quiet. She laughed lightly. "Mark behaving?" I hesitated, of course. He always does, she said. Sometimes I wish he didn't. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't that night. I made dinner again, nothing special. Salad, pasta with garlic and oil. He came down late, took his plate without a word. Ate at the table while I washed dishes nearby. Elizabeth, he said suddenly. I turned. He looked tired, hollow around the eyes. We can't pretend this didn't happen. Not pretending, I said. He nodded slowly. Then I don't know what we do now. I dried my hands on a towel. You don't have to know today. He looked up at me. But I do. I need to. Because every time I look at you now, it's there. I crossed the room, stood near, but not too close. And when you don't look at me, is it still there? He didn't answer later. I sat on the porch alone. The night was humid, the air thick, with unfinished sentences through the screen. I saw him pass by the hallway. He paused, just for a second, like he was about to come out. But he didn't. He kept walking. And I stayed where I was, holding my wine, listening to the crickets, pretending the ache in my chest was just the heat. By the end of the week, we had become something unspeakable, not lovers, not strangers, something in between. A silence threaded with memory, a glance too long across the dinner table, a hesitation in the hallway, a brush of fingers when passing the salt. Mark didn't bring it up again. Neither did I instead. We moved through the house like actors in a play that had lost its script. Julia returned late Friday, tired but smiling, dropping her heels by the door like she always did. She kissed him. He flinched. I saw it. I don't think she did. We fell back into rhythm, 3 around the table, 2 speaking freely. 1 listening too closely. That Saturday, she made pancakes. I watched them cook together, her in his t-shirt, him in flannel pants, laughing softly about the batter being too thin. My chest tightened around the sound. I poured orange juice and smiled like I belonged there in the afternoon. She left for errands. Mark stayed behind to mow the lawn. I stood in the window and watched him, shirt damp against his back, hands tight around the handle, every pass a refusal to look up. When he came inside, I offered water. He took it without a word. Thank you, he said, the same way he'd said it that first morning. But now the thank you was brittle like a warning. That night, she handed him an envelope over dinner. Open it. He blinked, confused, and slid a photo from inside. A sonogram. My stomach flipped. She was glowing, eyes bright. We're 12 weeks. I didn't want to tell you while I was traveling, but we're having a baby. Mark stared at the image. I stared at him. He smiled, delayed, crooked. Wow, that's amazing, he said. He reached for her hand across the table. She held it tightly. I didn't touch my food after that. I cleared the dishes while they cuddled on the couch, whispering about names, about rooms, about colors. My hands shook under the faucet. I dropped a glass. It didn't shatter, but it cracked. A thin, perfect split down the middle that night. I didn't sleep. I lay awake in the guest room, the ceiling flickering with headlights from passing cars. Every sound in the house felt magnified, floor creaks, pipes shifting, laughter muffled through walls. Mark didn't come to me. He didn't even look my way when we crossed paths in the hallway. But when I passed him the next morning, he whispered so quietly I almost missed it. "I didn't know." I paused. "I didn't either," I said, "but now you do." And then I kept walking. The house changed after that. Mark spoke less. Julia hummed more. She moved through the rooms in a quiet joy, hand sometimes resting on her belly, already imagining the child inside. I watched her from the doorway of the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, always from behind, always unseen. Mark wouldn't meet my eyes. He became meticulous, folding laundry with perfect corners, washing dishes immediately after dinner, clearing clutter like he could scrub the memory of what we'd done from the surfaces of his life. I tried to speak to him once. "I know what we are," I said softly, while he reached for a mug in the cabinet. He paused, then kept reaching. "We're not anything anymore," he replied, his voice flat. "But we were." He turned then, eyes tight with something between anger and fear. "Were is the only part of that sentence that matters." I nodded, though the breath caught hard in my throat. That night, I stood in the backyard alone, barefoot in the grass. The summer air was thick. The crickets loud. Mark stepped outside, staying by the porch. I turned to him. "You're pretending it didn't happen," I said. "No," he answered. "I'm trying to live with the fact that it did." He stepped back inside before I could speak again. I stayed outside long enough for the stars to blur. The next day, Julia left early for a prenatal checkup. She offered to let me come. I declined, said I was tired, said I needed to water the garden. I didn't move from the chair by the window for over an hour. Mark came downstairs, tie half done, distracted. He passed me, said nothing. I didn't expect him to. But then, near the door, he stopped. "I didn't ask for this," he said without turning. "Neither did I replied. He looked at me then. "You pushed," he said. "And you let me." The silence between us felt jagged. Then the front door opened. "Mom," Julia's voice called, cheerful. We both froze. She stepped into the entryway, holding a brown paper bag, her eyes bright. "I forgot my wallet." I forced a smile. "You found it now." She kissed Mark quickly. "You look like you saw a ghost." He smiled back, too fast, too rehearsed. When she left again, the door closed more loudly than usual. I turned to him. "We can't keep pretending." He didn't answer, just walked away. And this time, I didn't follow. I packed slowly, one drawer at a time. No rush, no ceremony, just folded fabric and zipped closures. Julia was at work, Mark too. The house was quiet, humming in that low, familiar way, like it had absorbed everything we hadn't said and stored it in the walls. My suitcase clicked shut around noon. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it. It looked small, too small to hold the weight of what had happened here. Downstairs, the kettle whistled. I made tea out of habit, carried it to the porch, the same porch where I had once waited for footsteps, for glances, for a different kind of silence. Now I sat alone, sipping slowly, watching a squirrel run along the fence. When I heard the front door open, I didn't turn. I knew it was him. He stood behind me for a long time without speaking. Then, finally, "You're leaving." I was never staying. He didn't argue. "I told Julia you were going back home," he said. "She cried, said she'd miss you." I nodded. "She's a good daughter." "She is." The wind shifted. Dry leaves scraped across the porch floor. He walked closer, but not close enough. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said. "There's nothing to say," I replied. He looked out toward the yard. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Things never are," I said. I stood, gathered my cup, and faced him. His eyes met mine just long enough to bruise something inside me. "I hope you'll be a good father," I said. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. I walked past him, suitcase in hand. At the door, I paused. "Take care of her." "I will." I stepped outside. The cab waited at the curb. The engine idled softly. I placed my suitcase in the trunk, slid into the back seat, and gave the driver my address. As we pulled away, I looked back just once. The house stood still, windows gleaming in the afternoon sun, no movement behind them. Just memory, just what couldn't be undone. And as the road stretched ahead, I whispered to no one I was seen. A pause, and that was enough.